Alright, today we're going to do a brief and incomplete look at text as the symbols of language. I really want to go over kind of the history and some of the basic concepts of how written language is one different than spoken language, but also just where it comes from and kind of how special and important it is as a technology. And that's one thing that's really important to think about is both language and writing are both technologies. They're both things that have advanced, they're both things that take work, they're both things that take teaching. One thing that's a little different is that language can oftentimes be picked up without specific teaching. Reading and writing are generally taught skills in, I think, almost every culture. Before we get too far with this, I want to note that we are going to avoid Chinese and Chinese-derived written languages, as they are just very far outside of our scope and would make what is probably going to end up being a long video even longer. And also, it doesn't really mesh with a lot of the evolution of the Western alphabet and Western writing. They just have different trajectories. So going back to writing as a technology, one thing that writing allows us is that it gives you permanence. Right? So when you write something down, that is just what that thing is, and depending on how the reader interprets it, of course, that can change it. But what's actually written down is the same. You can use this to both time and place shift your communication. So if you think of language as a way to communicate, right? Like, there are bees in that tree. You could write that down and hand it to somebody, and then they could run away from the tree, or you could just tell it to them and they could run away from the tree. There was a meme a while back about that, of somebody saying it's amazing that elephants have a sound for "there's bees, look out." And somebody immediately posted, of course, that humans have that sound too, except ours sounds like "there's bees, look out." So it's any kind of communication, but writing does allow you to time and place shift it. Right? Like, if I know there's bees in that tree, well, I can put a note and I can tack that note to the tree, and then anybody who comes by later will know that there's bees in that tree without me having to stand there and tell every single person. You could also use writing to place shift by handing them a letter. That letter goes on horseback or whatever to something else, or nowadays via text message and gets there. So let's start at the beginning and work our way forward. And really quick, before we begin with this, I kind of just want to show a little bit of a map of where we're going to be talking about. This is a Dymaxion map. It should make everybody completely insane. So here we have Africa, Europe, Middle East, India, China. This is what's now Russia. North America and South America is way over there. On this map, Antarctica's here, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. I did not cut New Zealand off, so New Zealand's still there. Now, we are going to start right here at pretty much the birth of civilization, Sumeria. And that's going to be kind of where we are going to get our kickoff for writing. Then, once we've kicked off from there, the two paths we're going to talk about, the Western path that kind of will end up being with our alphabet, comes up through the Middle East, goes in through Greece, hops across to the Romans, and then spreads up through Europe, and then there's a few more things that we'll talk about, but that is generally the spread of writing and the spread of the alphabet, starting here in Sumer and working its way across. Languages actually go out in all directions. I'm sorry, not languages, writing. I'm going to mess that up a lot, guys. Writing goes out in all directions from here. There are a few Indian writing systems or Indian subcontinent writing systems. There's some chance that they were independently derived, but it's much more likely that they are actually derived from this same prototypical writing system. Same thing with the Arabic writing systems across North Africa and the rest of the Middle East. Alphabets that are not like ours as well is you also get Cyrillic, which is the modern Russian alphabet, and that is actually going to come from Greece and then come up and back into Russia, and that's a much more modern writing system. So just realize that we are not going to talk about anything that goes east from here. That will essentially come down into here, into India, or into the Indian subcontinent. And when I was talking about the Chinese writing system is pictographic and ideographic, and that is just too much for right now. And that starts somewhere in this area, and then spreads through this region, out to Japan, and through the rest of China, and some of Southeast Asia. And then a lot of this region in Southeast Asia is either from here or from these Indian languages, or, around the long way by Western languages. So, when we were here, when the writing system was there, we started with pictographic letters. We started with, actually that's going to be a little too small. We started with the idea that things should look like what they are, right? So if I say I have an apple, right, I'm going to do a terrible drawing of an apple. Boop. My childish drawing of an apple. What this gives us is a symbol that looks like an apple, which is great. That's wonderful. I could say I have one apple, I can draw 2 of these, or I can draw 10 of these, and that gives me the knowledge that maybe in the bag with this note attached, there are 10 apples in there. But what if I'm really bad at drawing an apple? How do I tell the difference between an apple and a pear? Those are going to be very different objects. So you can combine this with some other thing that tells me that this is an apple or that this is a pear, right? If we're just going to make it up on the fly, I'm sorry, not a pear. Let's use a peach. If I'm going to say this is an apple, or if this is a peach, right, my symbol for a peach, well, if I draw that really fast, my symbols for peach and apple are not going to be terribly different. But if I know that, peach has a little rock in the middle of it, well, I can just draw that in there, and that makes my symbol for peach and apple very different. But we have to make a symbol for every kind of fruit, and that's going to get a little ridiculous. This is fine. It works for actually quite some time, but we end up trashing that and going on to something else. There are ideographs, which is literally what it sounds like. It's a graphic of an idea, where we use this in a more complex way. So instead of having our little fruit with the stone in it, maybe we use our symbol for fruit, right? We can even use a more simple symbol. We use just a basic symbol for fruit, and then we have our symbol for rock, right? Whatever that might be, I'm going to make up that our symbol for rock is this little square. So if I put these next to each other, we now know that I'm talking about this one, not that I'm talking about my apple. And then we would have to make up combination symbols for each of these things by the idea of that. Also gets very difficult. Language does this to a certain extent. It also depends on the language and depends on the writing system. So one thing we can do with a writing system is once we get past ideographs, what we can do is start making symbols for sounds. So instead of us saying fruit and stone, maybe this just makes the N sound, right? Or maybe this just makes the A sound at the beginning of apple. The symbol for A that we actually currently use, right? That's, sorry, I terribly draw an A. That's what a modern A looks like. It's awesome. Well, the proto version of that was some combination, and actually it's gone through a few things since then. One of them being an A that looks like this, more offset to the side. So this is older than our A that we use now. Then there's one actually between these two that looks something like that. I think that's archaic Greek. I think this one's Phoenician. And then what you actually have is that this is actually based on a little picture. So our original A is actually based on a little picture that is something, and oh my god, am I going to do this wrong? Boop. So this is the symbol for like a cow, right? It's a little, this should actually be a little more square. It's a little and this should be a little more pointy for a nose. But this is our symbol for what's a cow. Now, I don't know if this is the case, but this is an auroch. This is taking our symbol, right? If I have this symbol, that means a cow. If I have 10 of these symbols, it means 10 cows. Then we simplify that, right? Because think of how long it took me to draw this, right? I have one line, I have a second line, and I have a dot. And then if I go to this symbol, that's faster. And then if I go to this symbol, that's faster. And then only because I'm, I use the English I use the English alphabet and I'm used to drawing that, is that faster than this one, right? This is actually faster because you don't have to pick your pen up. You can also see in this symbol our lowercase a, see the shape of it in there as well. So yeah, so we're going from picture to a simplified picture, and then we just keep simplifying it down because it no longer means cow, right? A does not mean cow in our language. It doesn't even indicate cow. It doesn't give a cow flavor to a word. It's just the a, kind of sound. So it's not cow at all. Now, hopefully every time you see an A, you will think of cow flavor. So we start with picture, we go to word, we go to sound, and then we end up with alphabets. The alphabet is what we use. It is the absolute broken down set of sounds. Now, this is not really true, right? Because we know that all the letters in the English alphabet make bunches of different sounds, right? Like the letter C in English can be a hard K sound or it can be a soft S sound, but we use one letter to do that. We'll get into why we do that in a little bit, but just be aware that it is not a one-to-one, all the sounds we need to symbols that make all those sounds. We do have symbols that make all of the sounds in English and in other languages, and those are when you go to Wikipedia and see the pronunciation guides. Those are the symbols that are actually specific to every single sound, and they're great. They're just very complicated. We have two things when we want to think about what our writing system is for, right? We have two main things that kind of fight each other. One of which is efficiency, right? How efficient is this thing? If I have a language that has 2,000 symbols, well, it's not terrifically efficient. But if I have a language that only has 2 symbols, right? I only have 2 symbols in my language, but it takes me 20 symbols to write the word and it takes me more symbols to write anything more complicated, well, that's no good either. Those are both failures of efficiency. One is in learning and the other is in using. The efficiency just completely breaks down either way. So you have to come somewhere in the middle where you have enough symbols to get the idea across, but few enough symbols that it doesn't get overly complex. You can also have issues with too many symbols in which the individual letters within an alphabet start to look too much the same, right? So if I had an A, and then if I wanted an ah, and that was just had an extra little goober on top like that, well, when I'm writing really quickly, you might not be able to tell the difference between these two characters. So my A and ah, that might work fine, and that might give us more accuracy, but because of the way we write, because it's very quick, and when we're reading, we could have the same issue where the difference really doesn't matter. Now, accuracy is the other thing. Accuracy is hugely important. Again, the English alphabet is kind of a hodgepodge. It's just not that great for accuracy. It's not the worst, but it's not the best. Ours is definitely kind of in the middle of accuracy versus efficiency on both ends of that scale. One thing to note is that there's actually an interim writing style, and actually before we move on, let me show you There we go. So here's actually an evolution of the alphabet. So you can actually see that this little line up here, very pictographic, right? Very pictographic. And then they get simplified, and simplified, and simplified, and made a little bit more complex in some cases. And then you get down to what we have here. And we'll come back to this and talk a little bit more about that later on. But do realize that, yeah, it's more complicated than just my little cow. Now, types of writing by implement. This is a weird one because it really does matter, and it's something we don't really think about. I can make all sorts of shapes with my pen, right? There's no difference between making a line, a set of straight lines, an organization of straight lines, and this circle. But there are some shapes that I cannot do with this pen, right? It's very difficult for me to make a single wide line, and this is with a tool that actually can do that, right? A pencil would be even harder, especially something like a mechanical pencil. The tool would actually be almost impossible to make a thick line. So if I said that an A was this, and an A was that, well, I not only have to be able to read the difference between a thick A and a thin A, but you notice that I actually had to change the position that my hand was in order to write it. Just imagine being in the middle of a word and having to change the position of your writing tool to write that specific character. That's just not going to go very well. Another thing that we don't use that was used, a Babylonian script used stamps, used a triangular stamp. So it was a shape that was kind of like this, and in some cases had a little noodle at the end. So it was either that or it was just a normal triangle. Now that was a stamp tool used in clay. So imagine instead of this piece of paper, I have a sheet of wet clay, and I'm taking my tool and I'm simply stamp, 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 rotate, stamp, stamp, and doing that instead. Now, if I have a stamp tool only, some shapes like these are going to be harder to make, right? Drag a tool through a piece of clay, take a wet piece of clay, roll it out, and then drag a sharp tool through it and try to make these two shapes. You're going to have trouble, and they're going to start to look a lot alike because the clay pulls up over the edge of the character, and you're going to get a softness here, and you're going to get an elliptical shape on this guy, and it's going to be weird. You're not going to get really clean characters. You can get a straight line, but again, in our clay tablet, it would be very hard to get both a thin line and a thick line unless we use like a double-sided tool that has different thicknesses, or maybe we push very lightly and then we push very hard to get a thick line. But that has the problem of being independent to the writer, right? As the person who writes changes, well, is that a thick line or is that person's thin line? We don't know because we don't know the writer. So the types of writing implement really does matter. I don't have one here, I don't think. Let's see if I have a brush pen. I do not. Some characters are very easy or very hard to write with a brush, right? If you have a flowing brush, doing these harder edges is going to be more difficult. Doing a softer swirl is going to be significantly easier with something that's got some flex to the brush. So just realize that the writing tool and the substrate really are going to change how your writing happens and what good writing is, right? Like what is easy, what is efficient, what is effective, what is accurate, right? Like the accuracy of a thin versus a thick line, that's a pain. That's a huge pain. The accuracy of a triangle versus a circle, that's more accurate, right? It's more easy to determine the intent of the writer. So now I'm just going to put up some numbers, just because this does let us see. We could see Egyptian, right? And you can see that the Arabic numerals that we use are down here, so we can get an idea of what's going on. The Egyptian ones, straight carved line in stone. Right, that's going to be the easiest thing that we can do. The Babylonian ones are little triangles I was talking about. The Roman numerals are also very much inscribed lines, right? Single inscribed lines. Even when we get out to here, only when we get to 100 do we get something that's not a straight inscribed line. I think 50 is also not straight inscribed. Chinese characters, again, we're not going to talk about them, but you can see that they have a similar progression. Indian characters, similar progression as well. Mayan, very different, right? A completely different setup, a completely different starting point for a writing system, for a numbering system. Same thing with Thai. You can see that these, especially these first three for Thai, are going to be very different than all the rest of these. With the Mayan ones, right? Very simple, dots. So we get to 5, and then we get this line, and then we go back to just adding a dot, right? Most people were probably taught Roman numerals. You start with 1, 2, 3, and then 4 is actually 1 less than 5. You have 5, and then 6 is 1 more than 5, and 2 more than 5, and 3 more than 5, and 1 less than 10, and so on and so forth. And a smaller thing before a bigger thing subtracts it. A smaller thing after a bigger thing adds it. So that's how we use our Roman numerals. You can see that the Mayan system has no place, right? That does not have the pre and post place. So we get 4 dots instead of 5 minus 1. And we get 9, we get 4 dots and a 5 instead of 10 minus 1. So there's no left-right place, it's just little number and big number added together. One thing I would like you guys to kind of note and realize as we're looking at this thing is that most of these are very consistent to the 3s, right? If we cut off just the first 3 numbers, they're very consistent in that they are just sets of 1, 2, and 3 lines. 1, 2, 3 marks, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 marks, right? They're the other direction, but the Chinese ones are just 1, 2, 3 marks. Now, the Indian and the Arabic ones are actually very similar symbols. You can see that, right? That this 1, this 2, this 3 looks very much like Arabic 1, 2, 3. Now you say that, oh, well, those aren't 1, 2, and 3 marks. Haha, but they are. Arabic 1 is a single stroke this way. Arabic 2 is 2 strokes horizontal with a conjoined component. Arabic 3 is 3 strokes horizontal with a conjoiner. So these ones are all 1, 2, or 3 marks. Even the ones that we use. Every 1, 2, and 3 you've ever written is actually just a sloppy set of 1, 2, and 3 lines all put together. The Thai one is different. I assume you could probably pull something similar out of it, but I don't know enough about it, and as it's outside of our scope, I'm not going to mess with it today. Alright, so that was numbers a little bit, and kind of where we get some similarities, and also where you can see that the ease of making a mark really matters. So the type of writing instrument and the type of substrate is really going to matter for what works as an alphabet and what doesn't. There are many languages in the world. There are many what appear to be novel languages in the world. There are not that many novel writing systems in the world, depending on how you define a writing system. If you define a writing system as pictograph fiction, then there are plenty more. If you define it as an alphabet that is the components of sounds like we use, as far as we know, it's happened once, right? That's happened once, and there's lots of evolutions off of that, but as far as we know, it's happened once. There's a few, as I was saying, with the Indian subcontinent, there might be some argument for some origination there, and there's a few other here and there, but for the most part, it looks like that's happened one time. Again, that's not writing in general, that's just the concept of an alphabet. Does that make the alphabet super special, and does that make Western society the best because we have it? No, absolutely not. It's just one solution to a problem. But the interesting thing is, it appears to have only happened one time. In language, there's a reason that it works for what we have. It's kind of jacked up because, English is just not great as a language. But there's something called orthography. And what orthography is it allows encryption and decryption with no other clues, right? If I give you a little picture of a cow, right? If I hand you a note in class that's a little picture of a cow, right? If I draw a really pretty picture of a cow and hand you that note, Am I saying that I want to give you a cow? Am I saying that you're going to give me a cow, that I want a cow? Or am I saying that you're fat? Right? All those meanings we can think of as, little pictures of cows. Or does it mean the letter A? Do I want you to make an ah sound? So that's not orthographic. That means we have many solutions to one symbol. We have many ways we can use that symbol, and we need other clues in order to do it. What orthography does is it, in theory, allows us to encrypt language down to writing and decrypt language from writing, right? We can make sounds into symbols, and we can make symbols back into sounds. In theory, 1-to-1. That's, of course, hugely wrong. As I said, we have many different sounds for A. The letter C in our language, we use it for all sorts of things. The letter S can sound like the letter Z, or it can sound like the letter S. And there's a few different S sounds as well. Again, we have to use pronunciation guides in order to be really orthographic 1-to-1. But the idea is orthographic. The idea is that you should be able to look at any word and kind of sound it out hooked on phonics style. I don't know if they use hooked on phonics anymore. You're all probably too young to remember that. But hooked on phonics was definitely a thing, and you sounded out the word, and about half the time you were wrong because English is not 1-to-1. It's close, it tries, but it's just not there. And now, there is a reason for that. And the reason for that is that the alphabet we use and the language we speak are evolutionary derivatives of things that started out completely separate and then got jammed back together. And when they got jammed back together, you just kind of had to make do with what you had. Let's get our funny little map again. The language, or the writing system, came Sumeria, across the Middle East, up into Greece. The Romans, right, took pretty much everything that the Greeks did and were just like, this is ours now. And then the Romans, through the conquest of pretty much the entirety of Europe and the Mediterranean, spread around the Latin script that we think of as the English alphabet. We can go back to here, and we can see that the 1st century Roman, right, this is pretty much what was getting spread around Europe and the Mediterranean, looks real close to what we use. There are some differences in some of the way the characters look, specifically things like the Q. We have 3 characters for the 1 that the Romans used. Right, we have U, V, and W, which all make hugely different sounds. The Roman one just had this single character. One thing to note is that these 2 characters in some European languages sound very much the same, and that is a lot because these 2 characters are recent inventions. Right, these are recent modifications of a writing system that actually only had this 1 character. So, our alphabet comes Sumeria, Greece, Rome, and gets shoved all over Europe. Now, right up here is where English is from. English is from right there. Strange enough, English is not from England, but it is a Western Germanic language, which is essentially that spot right there, the coast of Germany and France, right across the strait from Great Britain. Western Germanic is also Frisian, which is still spoken, High and Low German, it's Dutch, and it's also actually Yiddish. Yiddish comes from that same family of languages. I forget the name of that source language, but that is essentially where all of our spoken language comes from. Now, that source spoken language predates the Roman alphabet. So you smash together all the words and sounds that you can think of in German and English, all the sounds, and then you smash these characters on top. Think of what it sounds like when somebody speaks Latin, right? It sounds different than English. There are different sounds in there. And English and German have different sounds than Latin, have more sounds than Latin in some cases. And so you have issues, you have problems, and you have kind of a thing where you have to, make a round peg fit in a square hole and you just get it done. Now, of course, when you switch from one spoken language to another spoken language with the same writing system, that writing system, like any technology, will evolve. And we can see that, right? If we take our Roman language here and we move that into modern English, which is a Germanic language, we had to add a bunch of characters to make it work, right? Now you can actually see the same thing. Archaic Latin gets split up and improved, right? Improved in quotes. It evolves into this Roman, which evolves into ours. And you can see that the characters changed. Really not much was added, right? They added the YZ over here. They got rid of some stuff. And then Archaic Greek, right? This is who the Romans stole it from, was the Archaic Greek. And then you can see that a lot of these things are similar, but some of them are very different. We lose a few things, right? We lose this character here. We lose that character. And we lose that character. Now, us losing those characters is fine. There's one thing and we lose this guy right here as well. Losing characters is fine if they don't do anything in the language. One thing you have to think about, that this is not just smashing a alphabet into a language and seeing what fits, adding in the things you need and subtracting the things you don't. It's also an evolution in, again, how you're writing the language, what tools you're using to write the language, what systems, but also efficiencies and commonalities, right? Like if you have two characters that are very close to being the same, it's very likely those are going to get wiped out because they're too hard to differentiate, or they're too hard to draw, or they cause other problems, right? You could also argue that these two are going to have problems together. And as these things evolve, some of them get more different and some of them get more similar. You can argue that some of these original symbols are going to have problems just because they're hard to differentiate, right? Like a little squiggle like that. Well, that's less, specific than a lowercase n, right? Which it eventually drops down to become an n. The M, well, that's just a lot of doing, right? For that little shape where we have an M like that. So think not only as this evolution as a language versus alphabet, but also as an alphabet versus just getting it done, right? This character here in Archaic Greek and this character here, right? These two are very similar. If you write these really, really fast, you may have trouble differentiating them. Some things also make very small changes, right? There is directional changes. Right? B just flips the other direction, C flips the other direction, D flips the other direction. So things can flip back and forth. The emphasis points can go to different places, right? Like the emphasis line on the N and the M are just upside down. If you just rotate these, they actually look a lot like a modern M and N. They're just, pointy. Same thing with S. Some get additional pieces because they look too similar to other things, right? These two characters in Archaic Latin look very similar, right? They both look like what we would consider a backwards D, one that's connected and one that's not connected. So that gets another stroke to make it obviously different, to make it visually different and more decipherable, right? Because we are encoding sounds into written language, and we're encoding sounds into writing, and then we're decoding writing into sounds. And we need all these little clues to help us do that without much trouble. And we're trying to make this as easy as possible, both efficient and accurate. And now, the needs of the culture will change this. There's aesthetics with this, right? There's style things, right? We can look at this and even see style things. When you look at all the fonts we use in the world, you can see the differences in style things. So realize that there is a style thing to this as well. One thing that's important to think about with style is that I don't have a good example of it. Actually, I do have a good example. One important thing with style is that style can make things illegible, right? These are black letter, and then the first typeface based on black letter, which is just a little thinner. This is hard to read, especially if it's in big blocks of type. Let me see if there's, oh yeah, here we go. So see how all the verticals are legible, but it's very hard to tell what's actually going on with these characters as compared to, say, the Roman alphabet that we've already seen. Right? This black letter stuff is very hard. It's very stylish. It looks good, right? It looks very good. But it's very hard to read. So please realize that as you guys are designing things and as you're thinking about what makes good type versus bad type, don't ever let style destroy your legibility. Right? The ability to read the thing matters the most because that's what it's for, right? If you don't need to be able to read it, it shouldn't be type. If you're putting type in, that means you're trying to have a symbol that turns back into sounds in your head. And even if you're not saying it out loud, right, it still turns back into sounds in your head. The modern Latin script that we're used to, this one that we see down here, the fact that we have 26 characters, right, 26 letters, that is early 19th century, if I remember correctly, but it's actually really recent. One thing to know that there's another branch from Greek. Here we go. So we have the Greek alphabet here, which is the more modern Greek, as opposed to that one right there. Right, the more modern Greek one does some of the things that the Roman alphabet does, like flipping the B around. We have a more modern Greek alphabet. Now, there's a writing system that we don't use that is still based on this Greek one, which is the Cyrillic character set, and that's what Russia uses, and I think some aligned languages, but I'm not 100% sure on that. It is not my specialty. So realize that this stuff branches, and that's what I was talking about with this little line right here. As Cyrillic becomes a written language that comes up from Greek, or from Greece into this area, and that comes by way of the Greek Orthodox Church. You get an influence in literally the writing style of a people because of the movement of a religion, much in the same way that we have the writing system we do because the Romans decided that all of Europe was going to be theirs. So we get that. Now, that's brief history that gets us to here. We kind of know why things are the way they are. One thing to note is when transferring between some of these languages, you have issues in pronunciation because of what letters exist and which ones don't. Perfect example of this is that in Russian, the letter for J and I is the same. In the Cyrillic alphabet, it's J and I, and you can see that only recently did English split out J and I. So I know that that's a pronunciation issue with Joseph and Yosef. Yosef being started with an I. That is a pronunciation weirdness that comes from literally just where you got your letters from way back when. That's always fun. So that covers this history portion. I don't think there's much else. There's, a bunch of stuff I have to skip just for time. But one thing I want to talk about now is the concept of literacy, and again, why we should take care to be particular in our characters and make sure that they are legible. Now remember that at the very, very beginning of this, I said that both language and writing were technologies, and those technologies are things just like a phone or the internet or having a car or whatever, that there can be haves and have-nots, right? There are people who can do it or can't. There can also be physical limitations that limit participation in the technology. It could be things, as major as being blind or having poor eyesight, in which you can't participate in the written word, except for modern inventions like Braille and things like that. There can also be other less completely destructive and completely removing from the technology physical issues, such as dyslexia. Dyslexia can cause a lot of problems, right? That's the transposition of letters, right? So letters look backwards or they're out of place. There's upside down. There's all sorts of issues with dyslexia. It is a range of issues. But we can see that there are some characters that can cause problems. Capitals really aren't the worst. It's mainly lowercase things. Like, let me get back to my scratch sheet. A P, a Q, and a G. Well, lowercase, and some Q's are just straight and some Q's have that little flip. If you have issues flipping letters across a vertical mirror, right, doing this, these are all going to be real problematic to read, right? If you have a D and a B, well, you're just doomed. Those are just mirrors of each other, right? At least these are a little bit different because of the floof on the end. But things like D and B, you're just doomed. So even though it's a joke, Comic Sans actually has some differences between certain characters in order to make it harder to flip. All of the Harry Potter books are actually printed. I think all of them are. I know the first edition are printed in an anti-dyslexic font. You can also find anti-dyslexic fonts online. In any case where you think that there might be dyslexia as a major issue, you should use an anti-dyslexic font. And really all an anti-dyslexic font does is it does something to make it obvious as to which character it is. That could be, descending this but leaving the B's, or maybe making the B a little bit bigger and keeping the D small, but just doing something consistently that once you get used to it, it really differentiates your flippable characters and keeps it nice to read for people who have dyslexia. Yeah, and that's just totally a choice on your audience. Younger people, you generally want to trend more towards that. There's also certain populations of English speakers that suffer more from dyslexia, but realize that there are many, many things that can keep you from participating in reading, right? Whether it slows you down or makes it so you can't do it at all, right? Some people are great at using their cell phones. Some people are just slow. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't get it at all. You might just only get reading to a certain level. So realize that you can have an effect on the literacy of people interacting with your design. Just some interesting things with this. The prevalence of literacy is actually interesting in that you can think of literacy coming about one of two ways, right? It's with any technology, it's kind of like this. You either learn it because it's necessary, or you learn it because it's available, right? Those are two separate kind of concepts. Having both is, of course, great because then you have both motivations to get it done, but necessity or availability are both options. Now, it appears through statistical stuff and through research that literacy is an availability limited thing, not a necessity limited thing. So just realize that is where that comes from. The availability of reading materials and access to teaching and learning is what controls that. It's not a necessity thing. Kind of off topic, but just kind of entertaining. The rise of literacy, both for reading and writing, and the decline of what was called orality, which is the kind of like making your arguments in speech as opposed to writing, is one of the factors for the Renaissance. And the reason behind this is that all of a sudden, instead of going to hear somebody talk, well, they can write down their argument, and that can be distributed, right? It can be shifted in time and place. It can be copied very easily, and it also can be copied with some accuracy. If I tell you an entire story or an entire argument, and you have to recite that argument accurately to somebody else, well, that's going to cause a problem. It's fine for things like myths, right? For stories, for songs. If they're not perfectly accurate, it's okay. But if I'm telling you how to do something in chemistry and you get it a little bit wrong, well, guess what? It doesn't work anymore. So when you're pursuing science in the same way that like the Renaissance pursued science, writing was hugely important, as was literacy. Learning writing and learning reading has a problem in that the learnability of a language and a writing system is very often at odds with its expressive power. The more you learn of English and the more you learn of the written word, the more expressive power you can have. To the point where some languages literally just have less expressive power but are easier to learn. We can see this in dialects. We can see this in writing styles. We can see this in writing levels. When you read something online, you can tell kind of what audience it was written for based on the content within it and kind of the learnability of that level of English. The way we speak is very different than the way that we write. We also get something very nice in speech where we repeat ourselves constantly. If you go back and listen to this, you will hear me either directly repeat myself or repeat myself in different words in the hopes that somebody who doesn't understand the first way I said it understands the second way I said it. One of the big advantages of this duplication is error correction. Error correction is important, right? Like just like I said, where you can tell somebody a story and you can tell somebody else the gist of that story, but that doesn't work for something where you can have zero errors, right? That the science example, you can't have any errors in that. So you have to have error correction, right? You have to have some way to correct those errors. Now, there's ways that we do that with computers, right? We use checksums and things like that, but there are no checksums in language. And that causes a problem. The soft error correction in speech, as I said, is duplication. It's also the way we speak. We can also use modifier words to guide somebody's understanding of a concept. Writing is different, though, in that the errors are specific to the symbols and are very often not without context, but the context is more limited, and you do have to go to the greater sense of what the word says, of what the meaning of the passage is. A really easy way to see this in English specifically is how badly autocorrect fails, right? Autocorrect just can dissolve some words, can completely change it out for some word that you did not mean at all. It's actually interesting. I actually have my autocorrect turned off because from what I've seen, it's easier for most people to parse a misspelled word than a misinterpreted word by a computer. So when your phone autocorrects a word, you're taking out the error, right? You're making the word a real word, but you're not giving any of that possibility of the reader to interpret the meaning. That can cause big issues in our writing, and that's one of the problems of error correction, is that we can kind of destroy our own ability to error correct, right? If I misspell the word professor, right, by one character, pretty much everybody's going to be able to read it as professor, no matter which character I mess up. But if my phone autocorrects professor to pressure, well, that's going to be a problem, right? Because you're not going to have any of the context. You're not going to have the rest of the broken stuff to kind of understand what was there before. So realize that some of the things that we use in modern writing can cause problems that haven't existed before and are really weird and sometimes very entertaining. Right? Sometimes it's very entertaining when stuff goes wrong in writing. The last thing I want to touch on is the decoding and interpretation, and this is a thing that you have the least control over. You have control over the decoding. You have control over taking, right? Let's go back to our original example. You have control over the decoding of this into sounds. If I write this so poorly you can't read it, well, that's in my control, right? I should make this in a way that you can read it, right? I could even just, maybe I'm being super designy, and I want to write it like that. Well, I can't read it at all, right? Terrible. So I only have control over the legibility and the decoding of that word. The interpretation of that word, I have very little control over. The only thing I can do to change the interpretation of this is including other content, right? This apple could be this apple here, or it could be the Apple company. It could be a conceptual apple. Right? It could be any of these things. But I could change it, right? I could change the color of the word, and that might change it, right? If it's a rainbow, we might know it's Apple the company way back when. If I make it red, well, maybe that's an apple the fruit. If I say apple sauce, right, if I add additional context through more symbols, we know that this is probably not the company, right? If I add apple computer, well, that's the company, not the fruit that I eat. So be aware that you have control over the decode. You don't have as much control over the interpretation. You must add other things to guide the interpretation of those characters back into words, back into concepts, right? We need to do this backwards. We need to decode all this stuff back into language and make sure that the way that we're reading it is correct. Not only for things that just literally have the exact same meaning, but things that are just close, right? I want to be able to read something really fast. I want to not have to think about it at all and get that thing done. All right, guys. Thank you for listening through this. It went a little bit longer, but we had a little bit more to cover than I thought. So yeah, this has been a brief and definitely incomplete look at text as the symbols of language. Hopefully you learned a little bit and aren't too terribly confused. Please let me know if you guys do have an issue with any of this and I can go into more detail on that specific thing. We will get more into symbols and how to use them correctly and how to guide that interpretation later on.